So welcome to today's AIM Center webinar. We are in part 2 of our AIM Quality Indicator series. We're in part 2 of 5. I'm Cynthia Curry. I'm Director of the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials, also known as the AIM Center. You'll see that we do have live captioning if you've turned on your captions. If you go to your Zoom controls, click on the closed caption button, and captions will start appearing along the bottom of your screen. Thank you to Megan for her service today, providing live captions. Also note that, let me go back one slide before I move forward. In case you just came in, there are downloadable slide deck and handout for today's webinar. It's a bit.ly/QI series part 2. So you can find both the digital handout and the PowerPoint. The digital handout is very valuable because it has all of the links to today's resources that are being shared by our presenters. You won't find links within the PowerPoint, but you'll find all of those links and resources in the digital handout. You are free to use the PowerPoint for your own purposes. So if you're doing professional development or want to share these slides with somebody else, you're free to do that. But you'll find all the links and resources within the digital handout. Please be communicating in the chat. We've turned off all of the audio, so there's no opportunity, unfortunately, to speak over your mics or over the telephones because of background noises that tend to interfere with the webinar. But we want to hear from you. Please use the chat. As people are coming in, I encourage them to go ahead and write who you are, where you're from, what you do for work, why you're here, and we'll be inviting you, prompting you to answer some questions and contribute in the chat as we go along. So here we are. Here's the topic for today is Quality Indicator 3 of the Accessible Educational Materials Quality Indicators for the Provision of Accessible Educational Materials and Technologies. Quality Indicator 3 is developing and implementing written guidelines. As a review about what the quality indicators are, there are 7 of them. During part 1 of our webinar series, we focused on a coordinated system and timely manner. Those are quality indicators 1 and 2. Today we're focusing on written guidelines. Quality indicator 4 is providing comprehensive learning opportunities and technical assistance for stakeholders. That's going to be part 3. And then 5 and 6 are all about data collection. Quality indicator 5 is collecting data, and quality indicator 6 is using those data through analysis and for continuous improvement. Quality indicators 5 and 6 have their own webinar. That's part 4. And then the final webinar in the series is on allocation of resources, and that's part 5. So for all of these webinars in this series, we're asking our registrants to go ahead onto our website and gain some background knowledge, and then come to the webinar and hear from some people who are actually doing the implementation of these quality indicators in their states and in their school districts. So it's sort of that flip model where we're asking you to do some self-study and then come here, learn about some practical strategies, some ideas of how other people are going about improving the provision of accessible materials for all students, including learners with disabilities. But you can always go back. So if you arrived here and you haven't had a chance to review Quality Indicator 3 or to watch the recording for the first webinar, which was on Quality Indicators 1 and 2, you still have an opportunity to do that. So the objectives for today, thinking about Quality Indicator 3 in the context of the 7 quality indicators, is that you'll be able to explain in your own words the intent behind Quality Indicator 3. So what is the importance of having written guidelines as part of procurement systems, selection processes for the provision of materials and technologies for students. Quality Indicator 3 could also contribute to guidelines around creating accessible materials. So if teachers are developing their own materials, whether it's a document or a video, are there written guidelines in place to ensure that those materials are going to be accessible? Learn from the experiences and practices of other states, and in this case, a district, to improve your guidelines for the provision of AIM. And then finally, know where to go to build more of your background knowledge and to collect resources for further learning. So even if you've done some homework before you came today, we're hoping that you leave with more questions and more motivation to learn some more. And of course, this series goes on, and the AIM Center is always here to support you through this process, as well as our very gracious and generous presenters across all of the webinars in this series. So as I said, I'm Cynthia Curry. I'm the director of the AIM Center. Also with me is David Davis of Florida and Jessica McKay of Ysleta Independent School District in Texas. And I'm going to have David and Jessica introduce themselves when they are presenting the work of their states, and Jessica, in her case, of her district, in just a moment. A little bit of background on Quality Indicator 3, in case you haven't had a chance to go to the website, learn a little bit about Quality Indicator 3. Here's just some, I guess these would be the cliff notes to Quality Indicator 3. For all of the quality indicators, there's both the statement, there's also an intent for what that quality indicator means, and then there's also a set of critical components. So on the slide right now, I have both the statement for the quality indicator and the intent. And I should also note that for all of our quality indicators, the design team at CAST, the organization where the AIM Center lives, developed a series of icons for our quality indicators. And I have to give them a lot of credit for capturing the essence of the quality indicators. For Quality Indicator 3, it's a figure of an individual reading a book. And they're all consistent. This one doesn't have the gear icon around it, but the way the seven quality indicator icons are put together is each one is within a gear, so conveying that all these quality indicators need to work together as a system. You'll note those on our website and hope that they provide a little bit of scaffolding to understand the intent behind each of the quality indicators. So the statement for Quality Indicator 3 is that the agency develops and implements written guidelines related to effective and efficient acquisition, provision, and use of accessible materials and technologies. So there are really three parts there that make this a very comprehensive quality indicator. So the acquisition would be that there are written guidelines around from where do these materials, these accessible materials and technologies come from. The provision, meaning how do we get that material to the student? Once we know from where we're getting it, how do we make sure it gets to the student in a timely manner? And then finally, using it. So what types of supports does a student need beyond just the technology to deliver the material? Do they need training? Do teachers need training? Does the family need training? So it's very comprehensive, which makes it a really helpful quality indicator because everywhere you go in terms of trying to figure out where might written guidelines have a place in our system, we tried to cover that. The intent for Quality Indicator 3 is that written guidelines include the roles, knowledge, skills, actions, alignment, and coordination required for the delivery of accessible materials and technologies in a timely manner. So that too covers a broad range of what written guidelines should address. And then of course the term timely manner, which is so critical. Timely manner was a topic of the part 1 of our webinar series where we talked about Quality Indicator 2, which is all about timely manner. And we heard from the presenters in part 1 that timely manner is defined as at the same time as students without disabilities. So if material is going to be presented on the first day of class, all students have the material in the format and with the features that they need at the same time. And the guidelines are communicated in multiple ways. So we want to make sure that they're disseminated broadly as well as in effective ways and allows people to learn about those guidelines in ways that work for them, whether it's convenience in terms of time, whether it is in a mode that works best for them, such as a webinar or an in-person training, or perhaps it's a manual because people really like to dig in and they like to read, whether it's in standard print and also in an accessible digital format. So thinking about written guidelines, not just the content, but also how do we deliver them? How do we make sure that people are able to process them and ultimately implement them? Then, if you recall, I just said that there are 3 parts to the quality indicators. There's the statement, there's the intent, And then there's also the critical components that go with each of the quality indicators. So for quality indicator 3, there are a number, like there are for all of our quality indicators. I pulled some samples for quality indicator 3. Of course, you need guidance on what the federal, state, and local policies might be. So depending on where your agency is, whether you're a state or school district, could be a higher ed institution, you want to think about what are the requirements that you want to include in your written guidelines. So it would include accessibility standards, of course, also could relate to requirements that are related to statutes like IDEA, could relate to copyright law, and of course it should include all of these. And then you need procedural guidelines. On the screen, on the slide that I created, I have 2 examples. So they're procedural guidelines for students who need accessible materials because of a disability. So there would be procedural guidelines related to the process by which the determination of the student's need is made. So whether that's an IEP meeting or it's a 504 plan, making sure that the student's need for accessible materials is included in transition plans and the summary of performance. So even though you might be thinking, oh, AIM in the IEP, it needs to be considered across a wider range of student documentation. And then, of course, there are procedural guidelines to make sure that all students receive materials with accessible features and in accessible formats. So it needs to be part of the procurement system. So what are the guidelines that need to be in place to make sure when a large purchase, for example, is being made by a district or by a state, that accessibility is included as one of the considerations when materials or technologies are being vetted for purchasing purposes. And then, of course, the delineation of the duties and the responsibilities. So who is part of this system of procurement, of the provision of accessible materials for students? What are their roles? Because, of course, we know that there's a lot of turnover in education at the state level, at the local level, and we want to make sure that it's not a person's name and not even necessarily a title, but there's somebody with a particular responsibility and what their duties are. So rather than tying this list of who's going to be responsible to people's names or to their titles, you need to be descriptive about what is the role of this person to make sure that if there's a gap, that responsibility is filled. So please go ahead and be entering in the chat. We've had some people enter. This is great since we started. I know Leslie has been adding to the chat the link to the event page for this webinar that has the PowerPoint as well as the handout. And please go ahead and enter your role, where you're from. And while you're doing that, do a self-reflection. Now that you know a little bit about quality indicator 3, maybe you know a lot more, perhaps you did some homework before you came to the webinar. Think about, to what extent is quality indicator 3 already addressed in your provision of materials and technologies for students? And there are three options. You could choose something else. There's no poll, so you can get creative and choose your own description of where you think you're at in your own setting, whether you're in a school district or a state. We had somebody from higher education in part 1 of this webinar series. Have you not yet started thinking about written guidelines? Have you started somewhat thinking about it, or are you really cooking? You've got a lot of guidelines in place that are not just written guidelines, but they're also communicated in multiple ways, that it covers a lot of the various requirements, provides people choices with how they learn about them and implement them. So take a minute and go ahead, reflect on that and enter it in the chat. So Mamodu says, really cooking, excellent. And if you want to say where you're from, if you'd be willing. And this is a no judgment zone. So if you haven't started, that's okay too, because I think we're going to learn a lot from our presenters who obviously have been doing some of this work, that they started in a place of learning and learning from others. So this is just really helpful for us to have sort of a range of understanding where people are in their progress with written guidelines, or just your system of providing accessible materials to students in general. Okay, so we have a just starting group of us are really cooking. Our district is still starting. So that is the case, isn't it? That oftentimes there's a core group of people. In some cases, it's a person who is trying to take on a lot on behalf of a district or of a state or of a school. And those first steps, that leadership is really important. Florida, here's your Instructional Materials Center. David, you're really cooking. Thanks, Kay. Need more coordination and collaboration. And Jane, Rhode Island, we have guidelines, but how do you get procurement processes? So requests for proposals, contracts, open educational resource curation, et cetera, to districts. So there's always something new. I think that's a great point. Written guidelines, any guidelines, of course, we want to make sure that they're written so that they're documented. They always need to be revisited because things change. Like open educational resources might not be something that's currently addressed in written guidelines if they exist. And honestly, not sure. I don't believe the district that I've been serving has any written guidelines, but there's technically a district-wide process, but there isn't a lot of administrator accountability. Okay, so that word accountability is so important. That also kind of goes back to the delineation of roles and responsibilities, is who is accountable for each one of those, for all of those duties that go into making sure that students receive accessible materials at the same time as their peers. So that accountability piece is really important. A lot of people, it's not a very friendly word, but we really do need it in order for outcomes to happen. So continue to use the chat as you have questions. Before I turn it over to David and Jessica, wanted to make one clarification, because you'll probably see two ways that accessible materials are referred to during the webinar. There's AEM and there's AIM. So AEM is accessible educational materials and AIM is accessible instructional materials. And I just want to say, for the purposes of AIM, either way, they mean the same thing. So I didn't want to go into great detail at the present time, because I don't want to take up the time from David and Jessica. There is a description of the distinction between AEM and AIM on our website, and you'll find that link in the digital handout. But in all honesty, it doesn't matter for the purposes of written guidelines or any other way you want to think about making sure that students with disabilities have accessible materials in a timely manner, whether it's a standard print book, whether it's a digital material, or whether it's a learning management system. It's all accessible materials. So just wanted to make sure that people don't get caught up if you see an interchange between AEM and AIM during the webinar. Okay, David, I'm going to turn it over to you.
David Davis. I'm with the Problem Solving Response to Intervention project here in Florida, and I coordinate the Technology and Learning Connections project. We, about around 2011, moved within our RTI project here in Florida, support for assistive technology, accessible instructional materials, universal design for learning, a wide range of things. We also run the assistive technology and UDL loan library in Florida, so we really have a focus on universal education and universal instruction in the classroom. So that's sort of where I'll be coming from on this. If you'll go ahead and let's go to the next slide. Yay. Okay, and there may be some lag in all of this because it takes time for slides to change and then for it to get back to our computers. So we'll just take some pauses as we go. So I want to start just by basically I'm going through and sharing some different documents that we have available, and then how we're providing support on those documents in Florida. And I'll start with, we have a technical assistance paper on accessible instructional materials. you have a link to it in your handout, as well as all of these documents you have links to in the handout. We did our first technical assistance papers, and technical assistance papers in Florida, these are fairly high-level papers. So these are things that take 2 to 3 years to complete and get all the approvals on, because it goes through lots of different review committees, as well as lawyers and everything else, and then has to have complete approval all the way up and down the ladder at the Department of Ed. So they're high-level documents that they help to drive the training and the support that is provided throughout the state. So the technical assistance paper on accessible instructional materials, our first ones were released in 2010, and we had two. We had one on AIM and one on NIMS. And the reason is, when we looked at IDEA, we saw that there was a difference between accessible instructional materials and specialized formats under the NIMS rulings and laws and such, because that was kind of directed by copyright law. But when you look at accessible materials for all students, it's way broader than specialized formats. So we had two different technical assistance papers. The paper was updated and released in 2017. So the link you'll have is to the most current one. They're in a sort of a question-answer format, and so it goes through pretty much everything that Cynthia mentioned a while ago, as far as going through everything from why is this, what's the purpose of this paper, what are accessible instructional materials. It mentions accessible educational materials and states that, you know, for the purpose of this, because of history, they're used in accessible instructional materials within, and also fits the context of Florida statute on instructional materials. Procurement, just all kinds of things. So there's a lot of great guidelines in it. One of the things you'll find when you look at it is that it really gets into, with Florida, as well as a lot of states, as people are moving to digital curriculum, it really gets a lot into different formats. So for example, as you go through the formats, one of the formats may be virtual reality. That's one of the ones that's listed in here. And when you're looking at accessibility and virtual reality, that's really a whole different world, because you're not only looking at things we typically think of when we think about accessible materials, but once you've moved into virtual reality, you're recreating a world. So you will have avatars that have wheelchairs and who will need virtual ramps in a virtual world in order to move from one place to another, to get into buildings. So it's really a very different thing when you start to look at accessibility in these types of worlds and what people are looking for. And it is something that I think is a current topic, and I'm not going to spend time on this, just to mention that there's a school where the high school, the 6th to 12th grades, it's a private school, a lot of it takes place within a virtual world, in a virtual reality. So when we talk about accessible materials for students, it really is a very broad range. And so there's a lot of just continual work on guidelines and working with people and training people. Most of our stuff is still around textbooks and digital textbooks and things of that nature. But when you start to look at statute and law, and instructional materials and educational materials, it's really broad. So there's a lot to do here. And so our technical assistance paper on AIM really covers a lot of ground and gives us a lot of the supports we need to provide training in the districts. We also, you'll have a link to our technical assistance paper on assistive technologies, because when you start to look at accessibility, we think that all these things work together. So we have both papers that we use to guide our training. We pull everything together, and you'll see that again in the third thing on the slide, which is our accommodations manual. This is, again, another document that's released by the Department of Ed for Florida. And when you get into the different types of accommodations, you'll find assistive technologies, you'll find things that people typically consider accommodations, you'll find specialized formats, you'll find a broad range of things and how everything works together. So that's sort of our, what I would say is our foundational set of documents to help people to really start looking at getting a handle on accessible educational materials and a classroom where the instruction is truly accessible for all students so that all students can fully engage. So let's go to the next slide. There is a UDL Publishers self-assessment rubric. What Florida's been doing for several years is we have a self-assessment rubric. It's called a UDL rubric. It's basically more of a transformability rubric on how transformable are your materials, what type of learning supports are in your materials, which are really important when you start to look at accessibility, because it's not just, when you look at the use of accessible materials in the classroom, it's not just if they are technically accessible, but it's also, is the accessibility done in such a way that they are functional for the instruction going on in the classroom, so that the students can really participate in the classroom. So if you've got a bunch of students who are having to cite references, that your student who's using digital materials and text-to-speech has also highlighting tools and note tools and everything so that they can quickly find materials, mark them, bookmark them, be able to get back to them, be able to cite references, be able to defend a position they take on a topic or anything of that nature. So the functionality is a huge part of accessibility. And I think when you look at, for example, in our AEM TAP, the technical assistance paper, we talk about the things, that the guidelines we use for accessibility in general, and we use the ones from the W3C, which they have two models, and we use both of them. Their early model, where they look at content, structure, and presentation, and then the current model, where they're looking at is it perceivable, is it operable, is it understandable, and I think the fourth one is robust or something, but basically means works with assistive technology. So we use both of those models as far as looking at our assistive technologies. And so particularly when you get into the usable, to me that also means functional within the instructional setting. I think that's a big piece to look at, is to make sure that it really is working with the instruction, and the instruction is designed to understand the material, so it all goes together. But anyway, so
David, can I interject? Can you speak to how that emerged in Florida? That it's not just the accessibility, but also usability within the context of instruction, because obviously the quality indicators really are about accessibility, and we know that ideally when something is made accessible, there are all kinds of supports and scaffolds that are put in place that make it more universally designed. But that's not always the case. Sometimes people think, they think about, okay, I'm going to meet the standards and be compliant and make sure that students who use assistive technology can access this material. What led to Florida thinking beyond that?
Several years. It's stuff we've worked on for many years in the past. And then at one point, one of our program administrators at the Department of Education looked at all the materials we were looking at, because we've always, Florida has a lot of different projects that really are focused on supports for students with disabilities as tied into instruction and achievement. So accessibility, how that ties into instruction, how that leads to achievement, that's been something that's ongoing. So there's been a lot of different materials developed. So Leanne Grillot, I think, who was at the Department of Ed at that time, was in a position to look at these things, and she pulled together some of the materials and created this rubric. And so because it came from those different materials, she reflected within this rubric not only the basics of things like text-to-speech, to your material support refreshable braille displays, or all your videos, captions, those types of things, but also looked at things that can support learning, which is your things like do you have highlighters available, in what colors? We tend to go with the standard 4 as a minimum. Do you have a way to take notes things like this, just different stuff that are learning tools as well as accessibility tools. And so they've been doing these things for several years, and then as the publishers do them, we have a group in Florida that goes through and looks at the materials too. The publishers don't get dinged on this. Primarily, we've been using it as a teaching tool. Everything is public, so for every year, for all the materials, all the publisher reviews and the correlated reviews that we do in looking at their materials are all published online, so everybody sees them. But as you go through, we've really noticed over the years shifts in what publishers are doing. Particularly this past year, McGraw-Hill had some platforms that some of their more recent platforms that are just really, we were just extremely happy with, because everything was not only very transformable, but all the learning tools were there and very, very easy for students to use. So the tools themselves were both accessible and functional. They didn't get in the way. But that's, the achievement has always been a big thing. Years ago, really, when people looked at things like accessibility, it was purely from an accessibility lens. When you would talk about, okay, but we want to figure out what the outcome is on achievement due to the accessible tools we're providing, we would really get comments like, why would you ever do that? It's about access. We've provided access. And so there's just been this conversation for years that we provide access, but we provide access for a point. And particularly if you look at an IDA, it is participation and progress in the general curriculum. So just providing access doesn't get us what we want. It's actually this participation and progress in the general curriculum that starts to get us down the road. So it's been those conversations over the years that led to the rubric and the particular types of questions asked in it.
Great, thank you for that background. Yeah, thanks for that background.
Okay. There's a link to where you can get information on our district yearly K-12 reading plans. Every district has to do a reading plan every year, and within the reading plan, they have to describe how they're using the principles of universal design for learning in all the classrooms with all of the reading materials, what type of data they're going to collect to ensure that this is happening, and who's responsible for collecting the data. And that doesn't mean that we're doing super incredible, things in UDL. It's like every place else. It just depends on the school and the district. But it is as far as guidelines and expectations from the Department of Education and the Just Read Florida group, it's very clear guidelines on what the expectations are that you should be doing to help to make sure that your reading instruction is effective for every single student. Then there's a link to a document on what's special about special education, a conceptual framework for a multi-tiered system of support and universal instruction that gets into how everything comes together, specially designed instruction, UDL, intensifying tiers of support, of instruction, all of these things that bring everything together. Because again, that's a huge thing for us. We want to make sure that everything is connected and flowing together and everybody's getting all this material. So whether we're working with gen ed administrators, special ed administrators, gen ed teachers, special ed teachers, whatever, the communication, we try as much as possible to make it consistent to everybody. Let's go to the next slide so I can get on through and get out of the way. You'll find a link in the handout for our AIM contact page. So we have a web page with contact information for everybody that really has the leadership role, starting with the NIMS Florida and Florida Instructional Materials Center. They do all of the Braille, but they also do all of the NIMS support. So they have an amazing database, an amazing data system where they're really looking at how their specialized formats are used in Florida. They also manage our digital rights managers. So in the tab on accessible instructional materials, that will talk about digital rights managers. And these are the folks that run that network. Every district has to identify at least one digital rights manager and up to 6 more. So there is a whole network to help provide support in all the districts on understanding the guidelines, the requirements, and to help with the districts in working through making sure that they're meeting the needs of accessible materials for all students. We also have a link to the Resource Materials Technology Center for the deaf, hard of hearing. They do captioning. They provide support on materials specifically for students who are deaf, hard of hearing. Next slide. And then our center, you'll find a link to us there in the handout. Like I said, we have a lot of resources where our goal is really how do you put it all together, which is why we are the Technology and Learning Connections project, because that's what we look for. How do we put everything together to make sure that we have a universal education system in place where all students' needs are being met, and they're all achieving and meeting the standards for the grade in which they are enrolled. And then last group I wanted to mention, we have lots of others as well. But the Florida Diagnostic and Learning Resources System, they have 19 centers around the state, and so they also are providing all kinds of support based on the information in the TAPs and the technical assistance papers on accessible materials, on universal design for learning. They provide support to the digital rights managers. So this sort of is just a picture of, as well as links to all the resources of the stuff we have in Florida. And we still have lots of work to do, but we have a really nice infrastructure in place. So anyway, that's it.
Great, thanks, David. And I just wanted to say that I was waiting for you to say Fiddlers, because they do have the Florida Diagnostic and Learning Resource System. They have the best acronym ever. They go by Fiddlers, and I just love that. There was a question that came in from Jane. Jane is a Rhode Island representative. What happens when you get a website that is not accessible? Who do you go to make this accessible? And Jen, I assume this is a question specifically for David, and are you referring to if it's a school website or a state website? If you say a little bit more about that to make sure that we address your question accurately. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and move on to Jessica. We will have plenty of time in the Q&A to answer Jane's question as well as others that come up. So keep the questions coming. Go ahead, Jessica.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm in El Paso, Texas. I am part of Ysleta Independent School District, so I am part of one of the big 3 districts in our area. I can't remember exactly how many districts are within our regional center, but I know we're part of the big 3. Go ahead and flip to the next slide for me, please. I do love that you put the little star there to remind everybody exactly where El Paso is. Whenever anybody asks me, oh, you live in Texas, blah, blah, blah. I know somebody in San Antonio. I said, yeah, that's not my Texas. So that's that big star, that's El Paso. Ysleta District has about 43,000 students right now. We're working with about 63 different campuses. I know our numbers are about 10% over 10% receive special education services. And a couple other things that I forgot to mention on this slide. We are working with our 3rd through 9th graders to be one-to-one on Chromebook devices. Most campuses have, like their kinder and second probably have like a classroom set of either iPads or Chromebooks, but just about everybody kinder through 9th is getting some kind of device throughout the day. We also have been, we're in our 2nd year for UDL campuses. We had about 4 or 5 campuses last year go through Universal Design for Learning training. This year we picked up about 10 more. And then next year, it looks like we're going to grow even more in terms of that, just to give you a little bit of a background on some of the other things that are going on with the district. All right, go ahead and flip me over to the next slide. There we go. So when she was asking about, where are you, not anywhere, somewhat, or really cooking, we're probably actually somewhere between the somewhat and really cooking. We've had some really big developments happening for us that's letting us kind of push through in terms of really looking to make sure we get some solid guidelines that everybody can find within the district. So the first one is the 21st century Campus Technology Access Checklist. This was created by our Innovative Learning Department. For other districts, that was probably going to be your Instructional Technology Department, but mine's cooler, they have a better name. It's okay. But that was created in the fall of 2017. And they had asked me to take a look at that document before they sent it out to their administrators. I've been working with their department probably a little over a year and a half, 2 years. I do trainings with their campus technology specialist teachers, either as a trainee or as a participant. Be able to provide a lot of input in terms of how it not only applies to special education students, but also looking at it from that lens of UDL and also accessibility.
And Jessica, can I just interject to see if there are, because this is not a unique situation where there's a district that has somebody who has assistive technology, accessibility, universal design for learning expertise on site. Oftentimes what's missing though is the collaboration with general education technology and with instructional technology. And then what can be even less common is that there's actual intentional professional development and sharing of sharing the allocation of resources. So I just wanted to ask if there are other people who are here in the webinar who have a similar setup. Any range of those, if you have access to, or you yourself are an AT specialist within a district. And then a little bit about, is your model anything like Ysleta's, where there's some collaboration going on between, we call it an accessibility general education partnership. So if you have something like that in your districts or in your state or in your setting, would be great to know. Thank you.
Sure. So this was created for administrators as a way to provide guidance for their budgeting and planning. Most of what we included in terms of language regarding accessible materials is pretty basic. I would call it, the bare minimum in terms of covering, making sure materials are accessible to your students. Part of the reason why we did this was kind of our first send out in terms of let's talk about accessibility of materials. But another reason why we did that is because we are one-to-one with our devices, teachers are just now, over the past year or so, getting comfortable making those materials, putting them online. So we really wanted it to be things that were easily recognizable. Most people can, at least if they don't use captions, at least know what those are. They may not use text-to-speech, but they understand the concept of like an audio book or having something being read to them. So we tried to keep everything just kind of nice and easy, so that way people that are those teacher-created materials, they felt some initial wins when they first started utilizing those tools. So we kept it pretty bare bones on those, but with that, it's really started to open up that dialogue within the district with the teachers talking about, okay, well, what kind of extensions can we use? What's the best way to create the documents? And we're starting to see, where you were mentioning earlier, Cynthia, about those PD opportunities. Not only am I the one that's providing those trainings now in terms of how to scan your documents and make them readable, that's being done by those other teachers and support specialists as well. So it's not just Jessica's the only one training on this now. So we're really starting to see people expand out and taking ownership of that. All right, can we click on to the next one? Okay, so somebody had asked the question about the website, and this made me giggle a little bit. This is our website guidelines. And what you're looking at, if you click on the link, is actually a draft. So these are not official. But what happened was, as a district, we were asked to look at the accessibility of our website, our district website. And as soon as that situation had occurred, we used Blackboard for our district websites. Blackboard had provided us with an accessibility training, and I was asked to participate in that training so I could, again, provide some feedback in terms of how can we disseminate this to all of our campus webmasters. So within the district, each campus has a webmaster, so they have their own page that they're running. Same thing for all the departments. Everybody has their own webmaster. So we got together, looked at how's the best way to disseminate the information. They would come during those campus technician trainings. But one of the other things I had asked to look at was, do we have something in terms of website guidelines that state how these websites need to be made, things like that. And the document you're looking at, like I said, is in draft, but it was initially created as a style guide, more of, we expect to see this information over here and this information over here. Please be sure to include, at least one news article about such and such per week. It really wasn't looking in terms of accessibility initially. So what you're looking at is just, again, some very basic kind of bare minimum aspects of accessibility, but we also wanted to make sure that we provided those links in terms of, hey, don't forget, according to our stated guidelines on our website, we are trying to be ADA compliant, follow, again, WCAG 2.0, and then Section 508. So we wanted them to have some resources to really deep dive into those. But again, just so when they're looking at that style guide, they know, oh, wait a minute, when I'm posting that picture, I need to make sure I've got the text description, or, oh, wait, when I'm putting links in, am I properly describing that link? So that's where that one came from. All right, go ahead to the next one, please. Okay, so this was my big project. And it is still a very much work in progress, but that's okay. One of the things I wanted to do is look at our district policies and our guidelines specifically. And one of the first places that I looked to was Texas Proclamation 2019. I am not going to talk about Proclamation 2019. I've read it. I don't need to read it again. But please go back to that first webinar. Angela Stanridge from Region 4 does a pretty nice job of summarizing exactly what that is. But if you want more information, please visit the Texas Education Agency on that. But what Proclamation 19 does is it provides a state-adopted list of instructional materials. And the idea is that as a district, if we wanted to purchase materials and we can go by the state-adopted list, we know certain standards are being met if it's under that adopted list. So there's certain standards within our curriculum standards, our TEKS. Certain standards are being met in terms of language supports, but also too, they've added accessibility supports in there. So, not only do they have to say, oh yeah, we're totally accessible, but they have to provide a third-party report that vets them in terms of those accessibility guidelines that are posted in Proclamation 19. So what's nice with that is if the district is purchasing from that adopted list, then we automatically know accessibility is in there. We don't have to worry about it. However, we are Texas, so we like to make things difficult for ourselves. Districts don't have to purchase from the state adopted list. They can purchase any materials that they feel would meet their needs of their campuses. But if they don't purchase from that state adopted list, they are essentially responsible to make sure those materials are going to be accessible to students that need access to those materials. So what I wanted to start doing is looking through our policy language to see either if the district was stating we only purchase state adopted, or if we are purchasing non-state adopted materials, do we have specific criteria and guidelines put in place before we'll purchase those materials. So through that journey led me to inviting myself to our publisher showcase, and that's part of our textbook adoption process. And that's really what this slide's referring to. So all of our materials before they are, and this is district purchase materials, meaning the federal and state programs department submits to the board, these are the materials we feel are best for our district for this year. Every year it rotates to a different core subject. So this year it is elementary through middle school for ELA. And then next year, I believe it's going to be social studies. I have to look at the calendar for high school. So every year it rotates through. However, campuses can purchase items that aren't approved by the district or that aren't purchased by the district. They can purchase their own materials. But if the district purchases the materials and provides them to the campuses, they have to go through this adoption process. So that includes all the materials getting screened through a committee. That includes people from the federal and state programs, people from the academics department, people from innovative learning, and potentially for fall 2019 will include myself. So I will be a part of that committee as well to provide some feedback. Campuses are provided a voice on the selection of those materials through, or the materials purchased through those funds, and the way they do that is through a voting process. What they vote on is what the committee members submit for voting. So the committee members are going to go through materials that are presented to them, say, yes, these meet what we want, these meet our standards, our rubric. Now we'll go ahead and put them forth in this showcase where teachers are invited to talk with the publishers. They get to give a sales pitch, see what's part of it. Teachers vote on it. And then based on those voting results and additional information, then the textbook committee submits their purchase proposal to the board. A couple of things is the rubric for the textbook committee does include some information regarding compatibility of devices. Like I said, we're one-to-one, but it's not necessarily looking at accessibility. So that's one of the things I'm going to be working with them on, is drafting in terms of that rubric or looking at our district guidelines. The other thing that's kind of interesting is if materials are purchased by the campuses and they're not using materials provided by the district, they don't necessarily have specific guidelines or regulations. Now, Fed and state programs recommends that they go to either those state adopted lists, for additional items that we didn't purchase, or there is a website or a resource called Learning List that we have access to that you can pull up and say, okay, I want 4th grade materials for science. I want to make sure it's covering these TEKs. I want this type of device compatibility, but again, within Learning List, it doesn't necessarily say anything about accessibility. So that's another thing I'm going to actually be looking at to see what standards have to be met before it gets put in Learning List's database. And that's where we are right now. So it's just going to be working through that textbook adoption process rubric and then continuing to look at those district policies and guidelines for specific mentions of accessibility.
Great, thanks, Jessica. I know that this was a really exciting development for you to be invited to join this textbook adoption committee within your district. So I want to give everybody else a chance to ask some questions of David and Jessica. You maybe have some of the same questions that I have for them around. I'm always really interested in how these initiatives get started. What's the spark that gets people collaborating and coordinated and pulling together? Because obviously you need to be pulling together lots of different parts of the system to include accessibility in the provision of accessible materials for all students. So here are two settings. Two very different settings, state of Florida. I think Florida and Texas have quite a bit in common in some areas, but we also have a district. I love that Jessica and David both showed us rubrics that they're using. And I'll also say, just from being able to work with Jessica and David, that and other states as part of a cohort with the AEM Center, there's a lot of sharing and exchanging of resources. So for example, I know Jessica was asking for some rubrics to go with some of the work that she's doing around the website guidelines in Ysleta, as well as the textbook adoption process. And who did I go to? I went to David's UDL rubric for Florida. So lots of opportunities to share and exchange some of these resources from states and districts that have started some of this work. So I want to give you all a chance to dig in and ask some questions. Going back to Jane's question about the accessible website, or what happens when a website is not accessible. So in this case, it's a publisher's website, is what she said. So it's not necessarily the content or the material that's under purchase that's not accessible, but it is the website. Is that true, Jane, or is it sort of a portal to the material that's not accessible? And while Jane is following up, we have another question. Any suggestions to review or evaluate current material in use in the district? So you already have materials. How do you go about evaluating, assessing the accessibility of those? David or Jessica want to take that?
Well, I'll start. What we call the UDL rubric, like I said, it's more really about how transformable material is. That's what we look at. We look at when we review the materials is a flexibility. So it includes things like text to speech, being able to change font size, you know, a lot of basic things as well as other stuff. So, I mean, that type of a tool that grew from some materials on just making digital materials accessible to begin with. So that's something that you can use, but it is geared to digital materials. So if you're looking at print materials, you might want an additional tool or different tool, because ours is really geared to everything is digital that's being reviewed.
Great, thanks, David. Jessica, any suggestions to review or evaluate current material in use in the district?
I think for me, it's anytime we run into a problem, it's something that kind of gets a little check mark, and I notify as many people as possible saying, hey, look, we have, you know, STEM scopes for science. And when we did a district-wide use of Snap and Read and Co-Writer, and when that rolled out, that was one of the first questions. They said, well, will this work with STEM scopes? And so once we got it working, we were fine. But the minute something doesn't work, I start calling my my IT people. I call anybody I can and say, hey, this isn't working, this isn't meeting, or is this meeting what standards we have in place? And really, that's just kind of the way we do it, is just, or at least right now, is just when we see those problems arise, we're making those notes and going, this is something we need to look at. So we don't have, to my knowledge, a specific review right now for current materials. I'm hoping that as we start working with this process with the rubrics, with textbooks, that will be something we can look at.
Great. So it sounds like what you're both saying is that you look ahead, you look forward. So the guidelines that you're developing, the work that you're doing is put forth from a certain date going forward, and knowing, probably doing some kind of a cataloging when something is being replaced, you know, making note of a lot of times the inaccessibility of that material, but also noting why was that material selected, what made it, you know, what made it the desirable choice at the time, what do we want to keep in our next purchase that we're going to make sure meets our accessibility guidelines. So Jane followed up and she said that it's the website that's not accessible, and she's referring to a publisher website. Even the materials are not accessible if you download it. So I think that this is a perfect case study. So you're in the process of vetting some materials. You're working with the publisher who submitted a proposal for their product, and you realize that the website's not accessible, the material's not accessible. What do you do?
And I, to be honest, when I read that, I see different things in it. So I'm not really sure what the question exactly is. Yep. But if just in general, the publisher's website is not accessible, just in general, I think that's a great topic to talk with publishers, maybe at the national level, from the the AIM Center or from CAST or some group that works with publishers to dialogue with them, that it's not just about, because a lot of them, I know their focus is, well, we have materials, we're putting them in the NIMAC, you can get things there, and they may not be thinking about their website being accessible. So that may be a whole nother dialogue to have with them. And for us, part of what we do when we review the materials that are submitted, and Florida's a lot like Texas, our districts can do whatever, they don't have to pay any attention really to the study document materials. They could do their own materials if they want to. So we have those same issues as well. But so we're looking at the learning management system as well as the materials within it. But the website of the publisher, to me, is even at a higher level than that. So I think that's really a very, I think it's a great comment. I think it really opens the door for some additional work with publishers.
Great, thanks, David. So you see it as a red flag and an opportunity for a discussion about what you mean by accessibility and pulling in some of the publisher's existing materials, and whether it's digital or print. And so Jane is saying, I asked that for the publisher to make the files accessible to me so that I could braille them. They couldn't give me files. They said they were aware of the problem but didn't know how to fix the problem right now. Okay, so send them to the AIM Center, Jane. Send them over to us because we have best practices for publishers, and the AIM Center would be happy to help them. We provide technical assistance for both the users of accessible materials, so that includes students, educators, families, as well as the developers of the materials. So send them our way. So think about what could be your first step. You've heard from Jessica and David about steps that they've taken for preparing written guidelines and guidance in their settings. What is something that you can do? You might not be able to answer this question right now because you might have, all of this may be new to you. You may not have had a chance to go to our website and delve into, do a little bit of an independent study of Quality Indicator 3. But although these indicators and the components can be overwhelming, as you dig in and you start to make sense of them, and of course the AIM Center is here for you. Jessica and David have provided their contact information in the digital handout. We're here to help you make that next step. Also wanted to let you know that we do have a progress monitoring tool on the horizon, should be available this summer, that will help districts walk through this process of doing a self-assessment of their procurement system, the way that teachers may be creating materials for students, making sure that accessibility is included in that, whether you are a district that uses open education resources. There is a tool that we're developing that will help you measure your progress toward making sure that accessibility is a consideration across all of the different ways that students may be receiving materials in the classroom. And then just a reminder that our webinar series on the quality indicators continues. Part 3 is on professional learning opportunities and technical assistance. That is Thursday, February 28th. Part 4 is all about data. That's March 26th. And I believe Kay Ratzlaff, I think she's here, or she was here. Kay from Florida's Instructional Materials Center will be here talking about the way they're tracking data, as well as Indiana. We'll have a representative from Indiana here as well, talking about how they use data. And then part 5 is on allocating resources on Tuesday, April 2nd. All of those are 3 p.m. Eastern. So just wanted to thank everybody. You can always reach out to me. I'm ccurry@cas.org. Like I said, please access the digital handout for the information, contact information for our presenters. And then finally, and I know Leslie has been probably dropping the link to the evaluation in the chat, please take a moment and complete our webinar evaluation. Let us know if there are any changes you would like to this webinar series, because we are going to be continuing. We have 3 more parts, so if there's something in particular that you would like presented or topic within those quality indicators that you'd like us to focus on, please don't hesitate to let us know. So thank you, David and Jessica, as well as Megan, our live caption provider, and of course, Leslie O'Callahan, who's helping in the chat. Have a great rest of your day.